Hello again. Ask anybody about lynching in the United States during the period from the end of the American Civil War up to the 1930s, and they will probably tell you that this was a kind of thing which was overwhelmingly perpetrated against black people by mobs of racist whites. As usual, though, history is a little bit more complicated than this. The idea of lynching has been used as a political weapon to demonstrate the horrors of a society which does not embrace diversity, inclusivity, affirmative action and racial balancing in education and employment. Old photographs of black people hanging from trees are brandished as though this is a likely alternative if everybody doesn't get on board with the woke agenda. It is, of course, utter nonsense. Lynching, the killing of a person suspected or convicted of crimes such as murder, rape or the abduction of a child, has been very common in most countries throughout the whole of recorded history. The British needn't feel smug or virtuous about this either, because the last lynching in Britain took place as recently as 1923. On September the 11th that year, a ship's cook called Robert Stewart collected his 5-year-old nephew and took him across Glasgow on a tram. Because he was smartly dressed and the child looked a little shabby, some passengers took it into their heads that he was abducting the boy. When challenged, Stewart got a little bit flustered, stuttered a denial, and this was taken as a guilty manner. He was chased from the tram and killed by being beaten to death. An attempt was made to hang him, but the washing line used broke. Nobody was ever convicted in connection with this lynching. In the frontier days of the United States, with the nearest court many miles away and no efficient police force, summary justice was the only kind on offer, and murderers and cattle thieves were hanged out of hand or after a very brief and sketchy trial. The practice continued, though, long after the conquest of the wild lands of the West, and was still popular in cities well into the 20th century. The ethnicity of the victims of lynching tended to reflect the demographic makeup of the area where they took place. In Washington state, for instance, which is on the Pacific coast of America, up by the Canadian border, the 18 victims of the lynchings there, which took place between 1860 and the end of the First World War, were all either Indians or white people. In New Orleans, at the end of the 19th century, there were a lot of Italians. And it's not surprising that when a mass lynching took place in the city in 1891, it was Italians that were the victims. Following the murder by shooting of a senior police officer in New Orleans on 15th of October 1890, a number of Italians were arrested. It was suspected that the mafia was somehow involved. Although the arrested men were all acquitted by the courts, they were held in prison pending further charges. On March 14th, 1891, a mob broke into the prison and dragged out 2 of the Italians and hanged them from a lamppost and a tree. 9 others were either beaten to death or shot. It was the largest mass lynching in American history, but no black people were involved. Curiously enough, when black people were involved in lynching, they were as likely to be members of the mob rather than victims. This does not at all accord with the accepted mythology and has therefore been airbrushed from the history of the subject, especially since the people they lynched were invariably black themselves. Consider the case of Joseph Craddock, a black man suspected of 2 murders. On November the 4th, 1903, in the southern state of Louisiana, he was hanged by a mob of several hundred people, and a fire lit beneath him as he died. It was a horrible death. This case is interesting because it's often listed as one of those terrible cases of black people being lynched in the southern states of America. you'll see Joseph Craddock's name often appear as a victim of racism. In the description to this video, I attach a link to a contemporary newspaper which makes clear what really happened. Joseph Craddock was actually lynched by a crowd of black people. Such cases were far from rare. The 1997 study, Under Sentence of Death, Lynching in the South, devotes an entire chapter to the subject of same-race lynchings in the southern states between 1882 and 1930, and shows that there were during that time more than 200 instances of white-on-white lynches and 148 black-on-black lynchings during that period. In other words, hundreds of lynchings did not feature black people being killed by whites, despite what we are taught today. The story of the lynching of black people by black mobs in the South doesn't really fit in with the received wisdom any more than the idea of white people killing other white people in the same way does. It's a little like slavery, in that the only narrative which most people wish to see is whites mistreating blacks. That black people were quite capable of enslaving or lynching each other upsets our sensibilities, and it doesn't really go with the perception of the world which is popular today, which is why you won't see much about these subjects anywhere. Black people lynching black people in the deep south indeed.